Okay. Mr. Patterson, you may proceed.
Thank you, Your Honor. Can you hear me all right, Your Honor?
I can.
Thank you. My sense from the opening that we just heard is that ABC for ARM could also mean anything but the contracts at issue. And I'm going to spend most of my time here this morning, given what Your Honor has said, on the contracts. But before I get there, I'd like to start with a little bit of context. As Your Honor can probably figure out, the parties have spent a lot of time, paper, and millions of dollars in lawyer fees and expenses. But that hasn't changed what this case has always been about. ARM wants help on a deal that went south on it. Medallion's economist, Mr. Barry Pulliam, will provide further explanation. Let me pause for just a moment, Your Honor. I have an obstruction on my screen. There we go. Medallion's economist, Barry Pulliam, will provide some further explanation. But this diagram, this simple diagram, identifies what this case is about. The blue line that you see there is the spread. You can hear that word a lot in this case, or the difference between crude oil prices in Midland and on the Gulf Coast from 2019 to 2021. The spread, or the difference between how the market values crude oil in Midland versus how it values it on the Gulf, reflects the value of a barrel on the Gulf Coast relative to the value of a barrel in Midland. Essentially, it's the market's assessment of the value of transportation services at that point in time. And let's talk about the black line here. Randy Lentz, Medallion's CEO, whom you met earlier, will testify in this case that in July and August of 2019, after months of negotiations involving the respective lawyers, ARM and Medallion reached a deal for transportation and terminal services. At the time, ARM agreed to pay fees for those services that were at market, $1.35 a barrel for transportation services and 15 cents for terminal services, a total of $1.50 per barrel. On the black line on the diagram, you see the $1.35 a barrel. Services began in April of 2020. That's also about the time a number of new pipelines were completed that would bring crude oil out of the Permian. And frankly, the timing could not have been worse for ARM. April 2020 is when COVID and a Saudi-Russian price war were changing the world. Economic activity around the world was grinding to a halt. Worldwide demand for crude oil took a nosedive. Oil and gas prices fell, in many instances, to below the cost of production. As Glencore's Mr. Freshwater will testify, production in the Permian Basin shut in, if possible. There was not as much demand for transportation or terminal services. And for a couple of months, ARM's assignee, Glencore, didn't even use the space that it was paying for. In other months, it sold all the space it could to other parties at discounted rates. It wasn't until 6 months out that ARM ever delivered. This would be about October of 2020, that ARM ever even delivered short volumes of WTI on the pipeline. This pipeline can go WTL, WTI. It didn't matter. That $1.35 applied regardless. There was never a proper nomination for WTL. As you'll hear from ARM's Mr. Wishaw, the only nominations it actually made were part of a scheme to paper up a breach. The market price for those services, the blue line, fell. You see the blue line, how it precipitously drops. The evidence will show that this spread between Midland and Gulf Coast crude fell from over $5 before the agreements were signed at the top left to well under $1 during COVID. That is, ARM was paying $1.35 to move a barrel from the Permian to the Gulf Coast, but the market was only valuing those services at that point at about 45 cents. You don't spend $1.35 to make 45 cents. That meant losses. ARM had a money-losing business model. And ARM had a choice to make. Stay in, pay the contract fees at $1.50 a barrel, and make what it could off them, or get out and try to get the best result possible in the courthouse. And ARM chose. It wanted out. It worked with Glencore, and we've got you'll see the evidence, to paper up a breach. Mr. Wishaw from ARM had Glencore make sham nominations of WTL and vessels. It filed this lawsuit. And much like how it overstates its claims here, it told the court back in the time we were doing the TI hearing that it would be in a death spiral if Medallion executed on the letters of credit. It wanted relief from its choices. And that, Your Honor, as the evidence will show, is what the case is about. It's about the difference between that black line and the blue line, which are the losses that they were incurring every month. A word about Medallion. Medallion was formed in 2010. Beginning in 2012, Medallion built 2 natural gas gathering and processing systems. Under the leadership of Mr. Lentz, whom you've met, Medallion has invested more than $1.5 billion to build 1,400 miles of natural gas and crude oil pipelines and related infrastructure. Here's a map of the Medallion system. EPIC. We also have a map of the EPIC pipeline system. It's on the right side of that diagram. To build a 70-mile lateral from Crane to Orla, which is just there under New Mexico, where it expected to receive WTL, EPIC invested about $100 million. ARM, it's introduced itself. What it hasn't talked about, though, is that ARM Energy Management managed Salt Creek Midstream. In 2017, ARM began developing the Salt Creek Midstream pipeline in West Texas. Here's a map of that system, of that Salt Creek pipeline system. The Salt Creek crude oil pipeline was going to have 2 unconnected segments, one around Orla for WTL on the left, and one to the east around Wink for WTI. And then if you put all the pipelines together, this is what it looked like. Glencore is an international commodities trading firm. In December 2019, ARM assigned the contracts to Glencore that it had with Medallion to use capacity on EPIC. The F13 and 14 are the assignments. So it was Glencore, sir, not ARM, that held all the rights and obligations that ARM now claims for the year when there was any performance. That is from April 1, 2020 through March 2021, primarily for WTI service. Glencore held all the rights and did the performance, but it's ARM that's here claiming breach. Medallion's contract claims are pretty straightforward. We've laid them out in our proposed findings. The evidence will show that during negotiations with ARM in 2019, Medallion was concerned about their creditworthiness. To deal with that issue, Medallion required that ARM provide credit support to assure payment of its monthly obligations for transportation and terminal services. ARM agreed. And the parties memorialized their agreement in the Transportation Services Agreement on Article 8 under Financial Assurances, and in the Terminal Services Agreement, DX4 at Article 1413 under those financial assurances. Now, when ARM assigned the two contracts to Glencore in December 2019, Glencore is the one who posted a guarantee in favor of the Medallion that it would pay the fees due under the agreements. And that's what we show here in Defendant's Exhibit 15. When ARM and Glencore terminated the assignments to Glencore in March 21, Glencore terminated its credit guarantee. And that's what we show here in Defendant's Exhibit 18. When that happened, as we show in DX30, Medallion turned to ARM and asked it to post required credit support. ARM declined and sued, asking for return of prepayments it had made and to enjoin Medallion from executing on two letters of credit it had posted. DX34 shows that after the court denied ARM's application for a temporary injunction, Medallion then terminated both agreements for breach of contract, failure to post credit support. We terminated the Transportation Services Agreement under Article 6.02, and we cross-terminated the Terminal Services Agreement under Articles 13.2 and 13.3. Medallion then made presentment on the letters of credit and received the funds. At that point, Medallion was still entitled to seek its damages under the Transportation Services Agreement, Article 602 and Article 13.4 of the Terminal Services Agreement. Medallion did. ARM refused to pay. Medallion served a counterclaim for breach of contract, and Mr. Pulliam has estimated that Medallion's damages after mitigation, but before prejudgment interest, at $11.98 million. Now I want to turn to ARM's claims. ARM has making the claims, obviously, to avoid paying those damages and to try to recover the credit support as well as even what it paid for transportation and terminal services that Medallion provided over the course of a year from April 1 through March, April 1, 2020 through March 30, 2021. ARM claims breach of both agreements. No party claims that the language in either agreement is ambiguous. I think Your Honor knows what that means. The parole evidence that ARM wants you to consider in construing the contracts, the parole evidence that it has trotted out here this morning, the emails, term sheets, drafts, and the testimony concerning the negotiation are not admissible for purposes of construing the contracts. The parole evidence rule bars their consideration to determine what the contract means. And that rule certainly applies, whereas here, the parties are sophisticated oil and gas entities that had representatives with extensive experience in the oil and gas industry. Each party was represented by counsel. In the arm's length transaction, the parties' experienced representatives considered and edited drafts of the agreement before coming to a final agreement. Mr. Lastman wasn't one of those lawyers. The parole evidence rule is also reinforced here by the fact that both contracts contain merger clauses that preclude consideration of negotiating history that ARM focuses on. As the Dallas Court of Appeals has observed, a written contract will be enforced as written and cannot be added to, varied, or contradicted by parole testimony. This is particularly true where the written contract contains a recital that it contains the entire agreement, which is the case here, between the parties or a similarly worded merger provision. The court should construe these contracts on their face. So let's start with the Transportation Services Agreement, and specifically with Medallion's contract duty to transport WTL. The evidence including the agreement, will show that Medallion did not have that duty here as to ARM on its claims. We've prepared a chart, Your Honor, that helps keep, I hope, keep the relevant provisions in order. And we're going to march through this chart, and hopefully it'll make sense to you, because it is complicated. The first thing we start with is the effective date. The effective date for the Transportation Services Agreement was August 22, 2019. That's because the Transportation Services Agreement defines effective date in Article 1.01 as the date that Medallion signed the agreement. And as we show there, Randy Lentz signed it for Medallion on August 22, 2019. From the effective date, as of that effective date and from that effective date, there was no provision in the Transportation Services Agreement that guaranteed ARM the right to transport WTL. And I'm going to show you why. Defendant's Exhibit 1, the Transportation Services Agreement, Article 2.01. You didn't hear a whole lot about this provision during the other opening. But Article 2.01 specifies that Medallion will provide committed firm service. And, Your Honor, that is a key term for the transportation of crude petroleum from origin to destination points subject to the Medallion tariff. There are a lot of defined terms in that provision about Medallion's duty. Article 1.01 defines what committed firm service means. ARM skips over this. Nowhere to be found in their proposed findings. But look at what it says. Article 1.01 defines committed firm service as, quote, priority capacity that is equivalent to the highest level of service offered or provided by EPIC Pipeline. Medallion's duty then, under this contract, was to provide the transportation service that EPIC provided. If EPIC didn't provide a service, such as for WTL transportation, ARM was not entitled to it. That's what the parties agreed to. If we go on in those defined terms, the agreement at Article 1.01 defines crude petroleum as crude that meets the specifications established in the Medallion tariff for transportation from origin points to destination points. Defendant's Exhibit 7 is the Medallion tariff as of the effective date. It was in place as of the effective date. And according to that tariff at Rule 3A, as of the effective date of August 22nd, 2019, the Medallion tariff did not include WTL, only WTI. That's what it says, between 36 and 44 degrees. That's not WTL. So from the very beginning, the Medallion tariff did not say WTL. Defendant, and just to close the loop on this, in Defendant's Exhibit 9, which is the EPIC crude pipeline tariff at that time, the EPIC tariff did not list WTL service either. That's WTI. So as of the effective date, we need to get that clear. As of the effective date, Medallion had no contract duty to provide ARM with WTL transportation services. And the evidence is going to show here, sir, that ARM's right to ship WTL, if any, depended on satisfying the conditions in the Medallion and EPIC tariffs, which was not even a possibility until April 1st, 2020, when EPIC completed its pipeline, its 30-inch pipeline, and added WTL service to its tariff. DX8, at Rule 3, DX8 is a revised Medallion tariff as of April 1, 2020. Rule 3 now provides that Medallion will accept WTL, Common Stream 2, for transportation on leased capacity defined in Rule 1 as EPIC pipeline from EPIC origin points per the quality specifications of the EPIC rules and regulations tariff. So next we go to what did the EPIC rules and regulations tariff say? That's Defendant's Exhibit 10 at Rule 2B. As of April 1, 2020, Rule 2B in the EPIC rules and regulations tariff provides that the specifications for WTL shipped from origin points are set forth in Exhibit B. So we go to Exhibit B. Exhibit B shows that EPIC agreed to provide services for WTL greater than 44 and less than 50 gravity. And that's logical because that's when EPIC commenced services using the new pipeline it had built, including for WTI. Before that date, however, before that April 1 date, EPIC had tried to get shippers to nominate WTL for delivery. And we show that in Defendant's Exhibit 165, where they got a notice from EPIC saying, make your nominations. Defendant's Exhibit 56 is a notice on April 3rd from EPIC showing that shippers hadn't made nominations. It says, due to changed circumstances. So EPIC sent a notice to shippers instructing them not to nominate WTL for delivery. If we look back at the Transportation Services Agreement definition of committed firm service, we see that as of April 3, the highest level of service that EPIC was offering did not include WTL service. And that's a critical fact here. Now, there are a number of reasons why EPIC suspended WTL service or asked for there not to be any nominations. Defendant's Exhibit 10, Rule 1 is, first, at that time, there wasn't a point where WTL could even be delivered to EPIC on a pipeline connection. Rule 1 defines origin points as a point in the tariff where EPIC will accept product for transportation. DX10 Rule 1 also defines tariff to include the EPIC rules and regulations tariff and the rates tariff. If we go to the EPIC rates tariff, which is Defendant's Exhibit 12, the EPIC rates tariff, as of April 1, 2020, at page 3, lists origin points there in Group 1. As EPIC's corporate representative, Mark Burney, will testify, there were no connecting pipelines into EPIC specified to carry WTL at the time. All these points that Ms. Shee referred to, pipeline connections, that wasn't for WTL, for WTI. EPIC carried only WTI. As Mr. Burney will testify, Orla was the anticipated origin point on EPIC for WTL service. That's why EPIC had built that 70-mile lateral from Crane to Orla and spent about $100 million on it. Defendant's Exhibit 12 shows one spot for Orla. You see it there. Ms. Shee referenced it. That's a reference to EPIC Crude Terminal Company Orla Truck Unloading Facility. That's a truck unloading facility. And if you see there's a footnote, it's one that says it's not, which means it's not in service. The pipeline delivery point off Salt Creek is not even listed. It's not even listed on this set of origin points. In fact, Orla did not become a delivery point on pipeline delivery point on April 1, 2020. The pipeline source of supply at Orla wasn't connected, and that's a reason why it couldn't be listed. The pipeline source of supply at Orla was supposed to be the Salt Creek pipeline that ARM was managing. And Mr. Burney will testify that it did not make the pipeline connection at Orla until June 19th of 2020. But before EPIC could begin accepting deliveries, there had to be line fill to commission that new delivery point at Orla. And Mr. Burney will testify that EPIC did not have sufficient line fill until July 2021. And as Defendant's Exhibit 177 shows, the EPIC pipeline connection, SCM Crude LLC at Orla, it didn't even go into service until January 1, 2022. There's another related issue about why EPIC wasn't providing or couldn't provide these services at Orla. Now, any WTL being delivered had to meet EPIC tariff specs. That's in the EPIC tariff at Exhibit B. The testimony is that even after ARM made the Salt Creek connection at Orla, there was a problem. The crude that Salt Creek had at Orla did not meet the EPIC specs. It wasn't WTL. It was West Texas condensate. So no delivery point, no WTL. EPIC also required in its tariff a minimum delivery of 100,000 barrels a day in order to deliver a segregated batch of WTL down the pipeline to Corpus Christi. We see that requirement in the EPIC tariff at Exhibit B. The minimum segregated batch size for barrels shall be 100,000 barrels per day. Now, EPIC had spent about $100 million to build that lateral to Orla. EPIC, the testimony is, was highly motivated to transport WTL, but it needed shippers to nominate a minimum batch of 100,000 barrels a day, and they wouldn't. As Glencore's Mr. Freshwater will testify, ARM wasn't able to supply even WTI to Glencore for much of the year in question. From April through September, it didn't provide any. As he also will testify, thereafter, ARM ended up routinely short of even WTI. Defendant's Exhibit 11 is referenced earlier. It's a notice from EPIC, effective December 1, 2020. Because there was the evidence will show that because there was no market interest in shipping WTL, EPIC formally discontinued offering WTL service effective December 1, 2020. And no one protested. No one protested, including Glencore. EPIC didn't resume offering WTL services until July 1, 2021, after the Transportation Services Agreement terminated. So they are providing WTL services, but they didn't begin that until July 1, 2021. Now, Epic also required a proper nomination. Defendant's Exhibit 8, and as did Medallion. Defendant's Exhibit 8 is the Medallion tariff. At Rule 8, it says that a nomination had to be done on or before the 15th day of the month preceding flow. Mr. Burney will testify that Glencore never nominated WTL to flow on Epic before December 1, 2020. And he'll also testify that neither ARM nor Glencore ever nominated WTL to Epic from a connecting pipeline that would actually carry WTL. So the evidence will show there was no breach of the Transportation Services Agreement. From August 22 through March 31, 2020, Epic provided no WTL service, so there was no breach. As of April 1, 2020, Epic offered WTL service, but then promptly suspended that service for a variety of the reasons we've gone through. So again, from then through November 30th, 2020, there was no breach because it was not a service that Epic was providing. It was not a committed firm service under the agreement. And then we see, of course, from December 1, 2020 through the time these agreements were terminated in March, Epic didn't provide WTL service, so there's no breach. There is no breach of any duty Medallion had to transport WTL to Corpus Christi for ARM. Your Honor, ARM doesn't really do any better under the Terminal Services Agreement. We've prepared a similar chart that I hope will help the court about the Terminal Service Agreement provisions. As with the Transportation Services Agreement, no party claims the language is ambiguous. So again, the parole evidence that ARM wants you to consider, all the parole evidence that they trotted out, is not admissible. The court should construe the contract on its face, based and not based on term sheets, emails, and other evidence supposedly bearing on the party's subjective intent. With one exception, Your Honor, it is relevant for the court to consider evidence of surrounding circumstances. And what that means is that the court may consider objectively determinable factors that give a context to the transaction, such as the fact that until the Corpus Christi ship channel is dredged, no one could fully load a 1 million barrel vessel at an inner harbor location. So we start with this chart. The effective date for the Terminal Services Agreement is easy. It's specified in the preamble. It was July 3rd, 2019. The evidence will show that ARM routinely, as it did this morning, conflate two distinct concepts: the right to nominate a vessel and the right to load a vessel. Let's turn to Defendant's Exhibit for the Terminal Services Agreement at Article 3.4a. Article 3.4a authorized customer, ARM, to nominate a vessel to load at a facility with a capacity of not more than 1 million barrels. We see that in the language. Specifically, it provides that ARM shall be entitled to nominate on a firm basis up to one marine vessel, the firm loading vessel, for the marine loading of crude petroleum either at the initial terminal or the new terminal, subject to the occurrence of the commencement date for the new terminal, each with a capacity of not more than 1 million barrels of crude petroleum. That's what the language in the contract says their right is. This is what ARM wants you to think that language means. They simply delete the words that I put there in the red strikeout. They want to delete those, so instead of saying what it says, it would say marine vessel for the marine loading of crude petroleum with a capacity of not more than 1 million barrels of crude petroleum. That's not what it says. The evidence will show that, in fact, the right to load a vessel, which they're claiming they got under 3.4a, is actually governed by Section 3, Article 3.4c, down below it. Article 3.4c provides that all marine loading of crude petroleum at the new terminal and the initial terminal shall be done in accordance with the terms attached hereto as Exhibit B. And notwithstanding for rules of construction, this contract expressly incorporates Exhibit B. Now, we go to Exhibit B. Exhibit B specifies, now we're in paragraph 1, that it's the port. It is the port of Corpus Christi that decides which vessel that is nominated may actually be allowed to enter the port of Corpus Christi and load. And that's just common sense. For example, paragraph 1, it's the port of Corpus Christi that handles nomination notices on a first-come, first-served basis. Paragraph 3 says, after a vessel has arrived at the customary anchorage or place of waiting, received all required clearances from governmental authorities, the Port of Corpus Christi. In paragraph 4, which says, the Port of Corpus Christi, Harbor Master's Office shall designate a safe berth for the vessel at which it can remain safely afloat and conduct cargo operations. What will the Port of Corpus Christi authorize? We look, for example, at Defendant's Exhibit 259, the pages 2 of 6. The evidence will show that Corpus Christi ship channel is 47 feet deep. It says it's there, strategically located on the western Gulf of Mexico with a 36-mile, 47-foot deep channel. Defendant's Exhibit 202, which ARM had, provides that the maximum draft of a vessel that the Port of Corpus Christi authorizes in the ship channel is 45 feet.
Counsel, your Ms. Shee, I believe, argued that there was a Valero terminal and a couple other terminals that were able to take Suez, was it called Suez Max vehicle or ships along that inland port. Why wouldn't Epic be able to do that if those other ones could?
They weren't loading 1 million barrels, Your Honor, because a Suez Max fully loaded will grind into the ship channel. That's one response to your question. The other one I'm going to get to in just a moment. They have a right. Do they ever really have a right to that Epic terminal? And I promise I will address that.
Okay.
The reason, what the evidence is going to show here, as I said, is that fully loading a Suez Max with 1 million barrels on a 45-foot draft would grind the vessel into the ship channel. And that's why the evidence will show that the Port of Corpus Christi would not authorize loading a Suez Max with 1 million barrels in the inner harbor, which is what ARM claims it had the right to. And that's also why, to respond to your question, Your Honor, ARM claims that there was a breach of contract by not providing it with access to even partially load a Suez Max at the initial or the new terminal. The testimony from Mr. Burney is that it would not have been at the initial terminal. The evidence of surrounding circumstances will show that the initial terminal will not berth a Suez Max. In Defendant's Exhibit 215, which ARM had before this deal, shows that ARM knew that. The IGC dock is also referred to as the initial terminal. It's dredged today to the common 45-foot depth, similar to other inner harbor docks. That was an Aframax capable. The evidence will show that the new terminal Epic was building might accommodate a Suez Max. But there's a problem here that ARM has. The Terminal Services Agreement, we go back to section Article 3.4a, says that a nomination to load a vessel at the new terminal was, quote, subject to the occurrence of the commencement date for the new terminal. Well, that's a defined term. So we go to Article 1.1, and commencement date means the date upon which Medallion first receives services with respect to the new terminal, expected to be June 1, 2020. That's what the language actually says. This is what ARM wants you to think it says. It wants you to believe it says, which shall be by June 1, 2020. It doesn't say that. ARM did not receive a right to ship from the new terminal if it was not built. And in fact, as the evidence will show here, consistent with what Epic was telling Mr. Lastman and Medallion, Epic started on the new terminal, got about 60% done, spent close to $60 million on it, but suspended construction because there was too much terminal capacity by then at Corpus Christi, they said, to justify spending more money to finish it. The evidence will show that Epic never denied ARM or Glencore the right to load a vessel that had received the required clearances from governmental authorities. The evidence will show that Epic accepted Glencore vessel nominations each time Glencore properly nominated and attempted to do workarounds when Glencore's nominations didn't. The evidence will show that there is no breach of the Terminal Services Agreement. Contrary to what it says, ARM had no right to load 1 million barrels on a Suez Max. And ARM had no right to a new terminal unless and until it was built and services commenced from it. In connection with these breach of contract claims, let me pause for a moment. Judge, do you have any questions about either of those two charts or the walking through?
I'm good. I'm good so far.
Thank you. In connection with these breach of contract claims, you're going to hear ARM tell you that Medallion materially breached these supposed rights that they claim, and it gave proper notice of its intent. You've heard the arguments about termination, and so I'll pass over that for now. But I want to turn to a few of the ARM opinions on material breach. First, if there was no breach, there couldn't be a material breach. Second, there are a couple points to remember as ARM's experts try to testify on this. Mr. Pulliam, Medallion's economist, will underscore these points. The evidence will show that ARM's experts' opinions rest on a series of what are factually wrong assumptions. They assume, for example, that ARM could buy WTL in Midland and make a fantastic profit by selling it in the Gulf Coast, in Asia, or in Europe. That, however, is not what ARM's own contemporaneous documents show, and the evidence doesn't support that business model. They assume as well that the right to transport WTL and load a Suez Max were valuable rights that ARM negotiated for. I've already addressed what the evidence will show. But there's kind of a fundamental common sense point here. If they really had these rights, if they really were this valuable, where's the evidence of complaints? Where's the evidence of complaints before they send that letter on October 5? There isn't any. The first time they complained was when they sent that October 5 letter. Crickets before that. Their analysis also does assimilate COVID. They want to convert the agreements basically into insurance policies where Medallion bore all the risk of market downturns. They assume a summer of 2019 market. They want to make Medallion bear the consequences from COVID, consequences of ARM not finishing the Salt Creek pipeline, or having crude that wasn't on spec for WTL. The evidence will show that when you cut through the noise, ARM's experts' opinions about the value of these supposed contract rights, even if they testify on it, and that's not clear anymore, are like ARM's claims. They collapse when you actually look at the words in the contracts, the facts, and the law. ARM had no right to terminate, particularly for performance, when it assigned all rights and obligations to Glencore. There was no breach, let alone a material breach, and the notice was improper. As you've heard, ARM added a fraud in the inducement claim, and ARM alleges, and there's one particularly important point I want to emphasize here, Your Honor. ARM alleges that during negotiations of the agreements, Medallion represented that EPIC would transport multiple grades of crude, including WTL, and then it would load crude onto a vessel with a capacity of up to 1 million barrels. I've gone through that. The Transportation Services Agreement doesn't say that, nor does the Terminal Services Agreement. In order to prevail on this claim for fraudulent inducement, ARM will have to show, among other things, that it justifiably relied on the representations it claims were fraudulent. But reliance on an oral representation that is directly contradicted by the express, unambiguous terms of a written agreement between the parties is not justified as a matter of law. As a matter of law, ARM may not have relied on statements made during contract negotiations on this fraud and the inducement claim that are inconsistent with the contract terms. In the last 5 years, 3 Texas Supreme Court cases, Orca Assets, Mercedes-Benz, and Bereshaver, applied and developed the principle that a party may not prove fraudulent inducement in the face of a contractual provision, as here, that contradicts the alleged misrepresentation. The upshot, Your Honor, is that if the court finds for Medallion that there was no contract breach, ARM's fraud in the inducement claim fails as a matter of Texas law. The remaining causes of action that ARM added during the summer of 2021 also fail. ARM is alleged string-along fraud by saying it was induced to continue performing the contracts by representing that EPIC was, by Medallion representing that EPIC would soon begin batching WTL and would finish building the new terminal. That claim fails because it's just a breach of contract claim that they're trying to dress up as a fraud claim. To prevail on a fraud claim, they'd have to show some injury that is independent and separate from the economic losses recoverable under a breach of contract claim. Mere nonfeasance under a contract creates liability only for breach of contract, not for fraud. A valid claim for string-along fraud that they want, or for fraud during the performance of a contract, requires that the plaintiff was induced to take some action not derived from a pre-existing obligation covered by contract. The evidence will show that Glencore simply continued performing its pre-existing contract obligations until ARM breached and the agreements terminated. This fraud claim of ARM's fails for another reason too. This was referenced earlier. Much like its fraud in the inducement claim, ARM has to prove that it justifiably relied on alleged statements from Medallion. The evidence will show that ARM had a direct line of communication to Epic about the Epic pipeline, shipping WTL, and terminal construction, going back before ARM and Medallion ever entered into the agreement and continuing during performance. Taylor Tipton, he's not going to be here live, but he'll testify by deposition, is the former ARM president. He's the one who signed the agreements for ARM. He will testify that as far back as 2018, ARM employees met with Epic personnel to learn about Epic's plans for the terminal. You'll see that ARM received and continued to receive construction updates from Epic related to the terminal both before and after entering into the agreement. The ARM employee who was responsible for purchasing crude oil for the Epic pipeline capacity will testify that he spoke with Epic and only with Epic about their timeline for WTL transportation. ARM was not relying on Medallion for information about Epic's plans. That fraud claim fails. They've also alleged quasi-contract claims for unjust enrichment and money hadn't received. Those claims failed because they're valid express contracts that cover the subject matter of the dispute. And under Texas law, when a valid express contract covers the subject matter of the party's dispute, there can be no recovery under a quasi-contract theory. And that takes us then to their equitable subrogation claim. As we've said, ARM wasn't the party performing these agreements during 2020 and 2021. Glencore was. We assume that's why ARM added a claim for equitable subrogation for the transportation and terminal fees that Glencore paid to Medallion under the agreements. But it doesn't work here. The first problem they have is that ARM has to show that the circumstances favor equitable relief. As the evidence shows, there was no breach of contract, there was no fraud. ARM has another problem with its claim. Equitable subrogation requires that the plaintiff, not acting voluntarily, pay the debt for which the defendant was primarily liable and which in equity should have been paid by the defendant. Another way of saying it is if ARM acted voluntarily in entering into its export arrangement with Glencore, it can't recover the fees it paid to Glencore under equitable subrogation. The evidence will show that ARM and Glencore voluntarily entered into a separate contract, their master crude oil agreement. Medallion is not a party to it. That contract was part of ARM's plan to have someone do the export business because ARM didn't have that kind of experience. ARM, on its own initiative, contracted with Glencore and created...
You're pretty far past your time, so why don't you just kind of wrap it up?
Yes, sir. ARM, on its own initiative, entered into that agreement. We have given you, Your Honor, proposed findings of fact and conclusions of law. We've endeavored to make them a fulsome statement. Respectfully, we will ask that you enter judgment in favor of Medallion. Thank you, sir.
All right. Why don't we take a quick 5-minute break and we'll start with testimony.
live right now. Okay. Pass.
Okay, guys. Let's go ahead and you guys all there?
Here for arm.
All right.
Good for medallion.
Let's go ahead and call your first witness.
Plaintiffs call Scott Wishoff.
And where's Mr. Wishoff?
He is here on the screen.
I don't see him.
I need 1 quick second, Judge.
Okay. Is that, well, it says witness.
As witness, yes, Your Honor.
Sorry, Judge, I'm ready.
Okay. Sir, please raise your right hand. Do you swear or affirm the testimony you're about to give shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do.
You're speaking very quietly. We can barely hear you. Please state your full name for the record and spell it for the court reporter.
Scott Wishoff. Last name Wishoff, Wischoff as in Frank.
Okay. You may proceed.
Thank you, Your Honor. Mr. Wishoff, could you tell us what your current role is with ARM?
I am the president of ARM Energy Services US.
And what was your role with respect to the agreements at issue in this case?
I was the lead commercial negotiator.
All right, before we get into the agreements and ARM, could you tell us a little bit about yourself? Where do you live? Do
I live here in Houston, Texas.
you have a family?
I do, wife and 4 children.
Could you tell us the highest, can you describe your education after high school?
I have a finance degree from Texas A&M University,
And when did you get that degree?
1999.
All right, since getting that degree, could you provide the court sort of a high-level overview of your career up to ARM?
I've worked in the energy trading business my whole career. I started with Dynegy straight out of school, and I've had increasing roles of responsibility from then till now. Worked at Dynegy, and then eventually worked for Eagle Energy, which was the original executives. Dynegy started another company after the energy crisis. Worked at a company called Freepoint Commodities, and then came up to ARM Energy at the end of 2017.
And tell us what your positions have been with ARM since you joined in 2017.
I started out at what they called the optimization group as the head of the optimization group, which reported up through AES, which was Taylor Tipton at the time. And I've taken on increasing roles of responsibility there up to president of AES now.
All right, why don't we look at an org chart for ARM? And we've got ARM Energy Holdings, and we've got a number of subsidiaries. Just generally, when was the ARM family of companies formed?
2004.
And who formed it?
Zach Lee and Gil Burciaga.
And what was their background?
They were both in the energy industry. Gil had been, I believe, since the 80s. Zach started in the 2000s.
And who currently owns ARM?
Gil Burciaga, Zach Lee own a majority, and the employees own the rest.
All right, let's look, if we look at that org chart. Okay, so we've got ARM Energy Holdings at the top. And let's talk about these. What is ARM Energy Services?
ARM Energy Services US, that is the division I'm president of. There's also ARM International, who another individual is the president of. ARM Energy Services is our marketing and trading arm.
All right, what about ARM Alternative Energy? What is that?
ARM Alternative Energy is designed to take waste product, whether it be animal waste, food waste, et cetera, turn that into renewable natural gas.
What about ARM Carbon Marketing?
ARM Carbon Marketing is a entity that is designed to trade or liquidate, in this case, the carbon credits that may be associated with either renewable gas, carbon disposal, et cetera.
All right, let's focus for a minute on ARM Midstream Management in a little more detail. What is the business of that company?
ARM Midstream Management is a midstream infrastructure company. They are most often owners of gathering and processing, or even a distribution to end users.
I'm sorry, I didn't get that last part. Distribution what?
Distribution to end users.
Have you had any involvement with ARM Midstream Management?
Yes, I'm an advisor from time to time on downstream fundamentals, what's going on in the market, et cetera.
So ARM Midstream Management has assets involving gathering and transportation of energy products?
That is correct. Typically oil and gas and natural gas liquids.
All right, down below that, we see 3% Salt Creek Midstream. What is that?
That is the Salt Creek Midstream ownership. That was 3% owned by Arm Midstream Management, 97% owned by Ares Capital.
And what was Ares Capital?
Ares Capital is a private equity private equity.
And did Arm Midstream, what was Arm Midstream's relationship? Well, let me back up. Did Arm Midstream have any relationship with Salt Creek other than its 3% ownership interest?
They were also the operator of the asset,
And what asset was that?
Salt Creek Midstream.
And specifically, what were the Salt Creek Midstream assets?
There was gathering, crude oil gathering, natural gas gathering and processing, and some NGL gathering pipelines.
Did Arm Midstream or Salt Creek have any role in the contracts at issue in this case?
No, they do not.
All right, let's jump back to the left side of this. You mentioned Arm Energy Services and Arm Energy. And I think you said this was an optimization business,
Yes, this is our marketing and trading optimization business.
and it's Arm Energy on the far left. That was the party to the agreements with Medallion.
Arm Energy Management, yes.
All right, now to the extent it's focusing on marketing and trading, what geographic areas does Arm Energy Management focus on?
Our base businesses are usually around producer basins. So we are in the production basins of the Rocky Mountains, West Texas, Haynesville, Northern Louisiana, and Appalachia.
And how does Arm Energy Management go about making money?
We buy and sell, we take title, we buy and sell the commodity. And the business that we're in is typically logistics businesses. And we create a portfolio where we can deliver various products to different locations or across different time periods with storage.
Now, I've heard in the trading and marketing business reference to the value of optionality. Can you explain that?
Yeah, so the value of optionality is the way to think about it in everyday life. You know, we've talked about we think about an option. You know, in the airline industry, when you're buying, you can buy the lowest rate price, or you can buy a anytime price that may cost you $50 or $100 more, and that's an option that you've purchased to have the right to change your air. You can transfer that, you can get a full credit back, et cetera. We're doing that with our energy business. We're buying the rights, but not the obligations to move to different locations or across different time periods.
And can you just give some examples about how you take advantage of that optionality to make money?
Yep. For example, we have natural gas capacity out of West Texas on El Paso Natural Gas that moves the Permian gas to California most often, but we have the ability to deliver into New Mexico, Arizona, or Mexico itself. Or we can even sell it in place. And in 2021, during Winter Storm Uri, Texas needed that gas, and we were able to buy our gas back in California from storage or the Rockies, other locations, and we were able to give that gas back into Texas where it was really needed during that storm.
How does Arm Energy Management's business differ from Arm Midstream and Salt Creek Midstream companies?
Arm Midstream is an infrastructure company that collects fees for leasing of their infrastructure. AEM does not own infrastructure. We are buyers and sellers of commodity.
What's the relationship between Arm Energy Management and Salt Creek Management, if any?
Just that we advise from time to time on downstream marketing.
All right, now, I don't necessarily need to pull them up, but we've already admitted are Plaintiffs Exhibit 1 and Plaintiffs Exhibit 2, which are the Terminal Services Agreement and the Transportation Services Agreement that were entered into with Medallion by Arm Energy Management. And you mentioned that you were the principal negotiator on those.
Yes.
Was anybody else involved in the negotiation on the Arm side?
Josh Sarman.
And what was his position?
He was a trader in the optimization group.
How did you first learn about the opportunity to do a deal with Medallion for the pipeline and the terminal?
Mike Lassman reached out to my boss, Taylor Tipton, and described an opportunity that he had.
All right, let's look at plaintiff's exhibit 12. I don't know if you've got a notebook in front of you. Can you identify this document for us?
This is an email that Mike Lassman sent to Taylor Tipton describing the opportunity that he had. And this is a subsequent email that Mike sent to Josh and myself after his discussions with Taylor.
All right, and the one from Mr. Lassman to Mr. Taylor Tipton was December 18, 2018, and the one that Mr. Lassman forwarded to you is January 2, 2019?
Yes.
And who did you understand Mr. Lassman was at the time?
Mike Lassman was the commercial representative for Medallion Midstream.
What's Mr. Lassman describing in this email?
He is describing capacity that they are going to have that moves crude oil from the greater Permian Basin to Corpus Christi through a terminal in Corpus Christi.
Your Honor, Medallion objects to this exhibit and to testimony about this exhibit because this is just an early term sheet type of negotiation between the two parties, which is clearly inadmissible under the parallel evidence law.
Response?
So I've got two responses. First of all, Medallion has raised issues regarding the materiality of the obligations that are at issue in the case, and we can rely on extrinsic evidence to establish materiality. And then I think more importantly, we've got a couple of documents that go to the circumstances surrounding the formation of these contracts. And as Justice Guzman wrote in the URI versus Cleburne County case, 543 Southwest 2nd, 755, Texas, 2018, the parole evidence rule does not prohibit courts from considering extrinsic evidence of the facts and circumstances surrounding the contract's execution as an aid in construction of the contract's language. But the evidence may only give the words of a contract a meaning consistent with that to which they are reasonably susceptible to, quote, interpret contractual terms. Surrounding circumstances can only provide context that elucidates the meaning of the words employed. As we have often stated, in one way or another, understanding the context in which an agreement was made is essential in determining the party's intent. Justice Guzman emphasized that circumstantial evidence surrounding formation that is objective in nature. For example, we're not talking about subjective intent. This is an operative fact, being the offer that was initially made and the discussions around that. Objective evidence in the nature as an aid to understanding the intent of the parties. This includes the commercial or other setting in which the contract was negotiated, and other objectively determinable factors that give a context to the transaction between the parties. And finally, Your Honor, neither party has alleged ambiguity or argued ambiguity. And we do think the contract's clear on its face, but to the extent the court ultimately finds on its own some ambiguity here, this evidence would go to that as well.
All right. Exhibit 12 is admitted. Let's move on.
Your Honor, may I have a running objection on this one?
Nope. You may proceed.
Okay. If we look at this, the actual email from Mr. Lassman to Mr. Tipton, I think it's the third sentence, he says, here's some definition around the capacity Medallion will have on Epic Pipeline. What did you understand was the Epic Pipeline when you received this email?
The Epic Pipeline was a pipeline being developed to move crude oil from the Permian Basin to Corpus Christi.
And when you say it was being developed, was it being built?
It was being built, correct?
Did Epic have other pipelines in the area at the time, to your knowledge?
At the time, they did not.
All right. And in terms of service on the Epic Pipeline, there's a volume of 25,000 BPD. What is BPD?
25,000 barrels per day.
And on the term, Mr. Lastman writes that we'd like to do at least 5 years, but we'll look at 7 to 10. You see that?
Yes.
And then on origin points, it shows one train anywhere off the Medallion system, Wink if Epic builds there, Orla and Saragossa. What are those origin points that are being referred to as you understood it?
Those origin points would be points of receipt where they would receive crude oil onto their system.
Now, did you understand that Epic actually owned this, that Medallion owned this pipeline?
My understanding was that they were executing an asset swap where they would have rights to a portion of the pipeline.
And if we look on, there's a lot in here, but I'd like to focus your attention on the last page of the email. And there's some numbered paragraphs I'd like you to look at, paragraph 6. See that?
Yes.
Okay, and Mr. Lastman wrote, I think it's second sentence in, on the dock side, I'm afraid we are not going to be able to hold them to a damages clause if their dock is not available to us on 1/1/20, but they may agree to damages should the dock not be in service by 6/1/20. I feel confident, however, that their dock will be in service near that date based on conversations we had not only with Epic, but with a few other producers on our system that are counting on that dock being in service 6/1/20. You see that?
Yes.
So at this point, what was the understanding as to when the dock would come into service?
No later than 6/1/20 and possibly earlier.
Now, on the first page, there's a reference to delivery points. You see that?
So it's
The first page of Exhibit 12, please. See delivery points?
yes.
Says Robstown, Epic, Corpus Christi Terminal. You see that?
Yes.
And paragraph C, he says we can go to Epic's dock for, quote, no additional fee. We will have access to their dock by mid-2020. It's our understanding they will have 2, possibly 3 dock solutions. One will be Aframax capable, 750,000 barrels. One will be Suez capable, 1 million barrels. And Harbor Island Project, VLCC, capable of 2 million barrels. What is a VLCC?
VLCC is a very large crude carrier. It is the largest vessel for crude, carries up to 2 million barrels.
Okay, and he says, it is our understanding they will have 2, possibly 3 dock solutions. What was the possible third dock solution as you understood it?
The Harbor Island Project, VLCC capable.
At the time you received this email, did you have an understanding as to what grades of oil Epic would be shipping on this new pipeline?
Yes, they were building their system to move into the Delaware Basin, which was in the greater Permian Basin, where there would be light barrels. They'd also be able to pick up, or to be specific, WTI light barrels. They would also be able to pick up WTI barrels in Midland or other locations.
Let's look at Defendant's Exhibit 205. And is this a series of emails between Epic and ARM in August of 2018?
Yes,
So this would have been before you received that email from Mr. Lastman?
yes,
And there's a first email is an email from Jeff Darrow to somebody named Dustin Snook with an Epic email address, and Taylor Tipton. And Mr. Tipton again was your boss at this time.
yes, that's correct.
And Mr. Darrow wrote, Taylor, I heard from Phil, you were looking at taking some more space. See that?
Yes,
And above that, he asks Dustin, please send Taylor with Salt Creek, the second open season presentation, T&D and rules and regulations. You see that?
yes,
And then Mr. Snook sends an email to Mr. Tipton, says, please see attached. See that?
yes,
Mr. Tipton sends that to you, and Mr. Sarman and others, and says, Moss capacity, let's round up next week. You see that?
yes,
So did you receive this in August of 2018?
yes.
All right, if we can go 3 pages in, could you tell me what this document is that was sent to you?
This is the proposed Epic crude pipeline FERC tariff.
All right, and if we look at the page, dates numbered AEM 240. Is this part of that draft tariff?
Yes,
And what is this telling you about the grades of crude that Epic anticipates shipping on this pipeline?
there would be 2 grades, the Permian Common Stream 1, which we would refer to as WTI, and Permian Common Stream 2, which we refer to as WTI Light.
All right, now let's go a little bit further. And there was another attachment. I'm afraid there's no Bates number, but it's if you can go to the front page of this, Brian. It's like page 1 of this, just so we see what it is. It's page 5. Let's go to page. All right, let's go to the next page. This is page 6. All right, the page that immediately follows this. All right, there we go. What was this attachment?
This was a shippers meeting, I believe, Epic presentation.
All right, and if we look at page 8, page numbered 8, it says crude segregation and specs. Permian volume will be segregated into 2 quality streams, Permian low API 36 API to 44 API, and Permian high API 44 to 48. And then potential for third batch for higher gravity condensate. What is this? What did you understand this to mean?
That they were going to ship WTI, which is the Permian low, WTI light, which is Permian high, and that they are also looking at a future gravity that would be higher than the WTI light.
And if we go to a couple pages before that, in this presentation by Epic, on page 5, you see there's a system overview, and it's talks about a 730 miles of pipe capable of moving 440,000 to 675,000 barrels of oil per day from the Permian. See that?
Yes,
And pipeline will extend to Orla, Saragossa, Crane, Wink, and Midland. Are any of those locations WTL, West Texas Intermediate Light locations?
yes, Orla, Crane would be both, Wink would be both, and Saragossa in theory was light, and Midland was WTI.
All right, and then down the third big bullet point, it says Epic Waterborne Terminal. It says 2 Suez Max capable private dock with throughput capacity of 350,000 barrels per day, each in service first half of 2020. You see that?
Yes,
And again, Suez Max capable would be 1 million barrels.
1 million barrels, yes.
So you received this package from Epic in August of 2018, and then you got the proposal from Mr. Lastman in January of 2020, right?
19.
Oh, yeah, 19.
Yes,
And was this presentation consistent with what Mr. Lastman was telling you?
yes.
Why was the Medallion Epic deal of interest to ARM at the time?
ARM as a company had done a lot of work on what the best producing basins were in North America, and really believed that the Permian Basin, and specifically the Delaware Basin of the Permian, would be a growth engine, not only for the U.S., but would be for the world. And the Delaware Basin, those barrels were getting lighter. A lot of this new infrastructure was being built to carry that light barrel. The light barrel is needed in Asia and other areas. And in the US, they tend to use WTI or heavier grades. So what was intriguing was that a lot of the big pipelines, they were taking very large commitments, life of lease dedications, 100,000 barrels a day, 300,000 barrels a day, 25,000 barrels a day plus the 2778 was a volume that ARM could handle and fit us very well. And it would help us complete that thesis that we had as AEM.
Yeah, and you talk about WTI versus WTL. Was there any difference in the types of crude that refineries in the U.S. Refined versus types of crude that are refined in global markets?
Yes, in the U.S., the U.S. refineries are typically tooled for a WTI or heavier, and Asia specifically likes the lighter barrels and is a buyer on the international market for those lighter barrels.
Was there any optionality embedded in the deal that you were considering with Medallion?
Yes, so this is a 5-year term. So there is different grades, different qualities that we could ship, WTI and WTL, over 5 years. Each of those will have different values at different times and create opportunities for us. We also have opportunity to sell those barrels in the Permian Basin. We could sell them in Corpus Christi. We could put them on the water and have access to the entire world, Asia, Europe, Latin America. So time, qualities, and locations, which fit all of our bills.
Was the fact that the dock would have Suezmax capability important?
Yes.
Why?
2 reasons. 1 million barrels vessel. There's good efficiency on the water. When you're on the water, it is typically a volume and efficiencies market. And our volume of 27,778, we would need a vessel of that size to move that MDQ.
Okay, you used a term there, MDQ.
I'm sorry.
2778. So,
The barrels per day that we would be shipping on the pipe.
and what does MDQ stand for?
Maximum daily quantity.
And that would be the maximum daily quantity that you would be required to either ship or pay.
Correct.
Before you could proceed with a deal like this, did you need any type of internal approval?
Yes, we have an investment committee that we would propose the deal to.
And how did you normally go about getting approval from the investment committee?
We would send an email with some of the deal basics, often with a risk and a conservative valuation to notify them of what we were looking at.
All right, let's look at defendant's exhibit. Well, before we do that, I know it's a defense exhibit, but we would offer defense exhibit 205.
Any objection to Defense Exhibit 205?
Objection.
Defense Exhibit 205 is admitted.
All right, and I'm now going to turn to another defense exhibit, 114. We can take a look at that. And this is an email from Josh Sarman to Taylor Tipton, Russell Schneider, Bo Dunn, and Scott Wish on you, dated February 8, 2019. And what is this document?
This is Josh's summary of to the investment committee of the opportunity that we were looking at on the medallion structure.
And there's a deck or just a PowerPoint page on the next page. Was that included with the email and presented to the investment committee?
Yes.
And there's a reference to an intrinsic value and an extrinsic value. Can you just briefly explain what those two different values are?
So the intrinsic value would be calculation of two pricing points that were available to us at the time, which would have been Midland in the Permian Basin and MEH in the Coastal Basin, which stands for Magellan East Houston. Those had forward financial contracts that we could value. And the intrinsic estimate is the MEH price less the demand charges to Midland. The extrinsic value is an estimate of Brent. Once again, Brent crude oil. It has a futures contract that you can value 5 years out. And so that was another proxy that we are using for a conservative international price to represent what barrels on the water could look like.
And if we go back to the first page, the third paragraph down, it says multiple parties, Gunvor and Vitol, have expressed interest in participating in this export option. Do you see that?
Yes.
What was the significance of, well, first of all, what is Gunvor and what is Vitol?
Gunvor and Vitol are two of the largest international crude oil shippers and traders.
And what was the significance of their interest in the deal?
ARM is not a waterborne trading company. That is typically reserved for very large companies. And we would need a partner to facilitate international deliveries.
And did you get approval to proceed with negotiations of the deal?
Yes.
And other than Mr. Lastman, did you negotiate with anybody at Medallion?
Commercially, no.
All right, let's look at, we'd offered Defendant's Exhibit 114.
Any objection?
Objection.
I couldn't hear you. Say that again.
No objection. No objection.
114 is submitted. Independence 114 is submitted.
All right.
You can proceed.
All right, can you generally describe how the negotiation, I mean, just high level, how you went from getting approval to getting contract?
Counsel, you've got to speak up.
I'm sorry, Your Honor.
You're not in a position.
How's this? Is it better?
It's better.
All right. How did you go from getting approval from your investment committee to negotiating a deal with Medallion?
So the investment committee gave us the approval to proceed. And from that point, we began negotiations with Medallion that would culminate over time. And then we would have to get a final sign off by investment committee as well.
All right, let's look at Plaintiff's Exhibit 31. Is this an email from Mr. Lastman to you, Taylor Tipton, Josh Sarman, dated April 12, 2019?
Yes.
And he wrote, we've fully executed our transaction with Epic. What did you understand the transaction with Epic was?
The asset swap between the Medallion system and the Epic system.
He goes on to say, as a result, we have defined the transportation and terminaling services we will be receiving on Epic system and are finally ready to enter into our transaction with ARM. See that?
Yes.
What did you understand he was saying there?
My understanding was that they had finalized all the details of their negotiation and they were ready to finalize the details with us as well.
And a little bit further down, he says, from a process standpoint, I've attached a rough term sheet to this email. I would like to make sure we are in agreement on commercial terms before we prepare a precedent agreement outlining the specific details of the open season. Do you see that?
Yes.
And what's a precedent agreement and what's an open season?
The precedent agreement would be the contract outlining our services, et cetera. And the open season is it's not a FERC process, but it is a process that is opened to the market for others to bid on if they wish.
And if we can look at the term sheet that he attached, or is the next page that term sheet? Next 2 pages?
I'm not seeing it.
I know we're there we go. Is this the term sheet that he sent?
Yes, it is.
And it shows an initial term of 5 years, right?
Yes,
And the volume 25,000 barrels per day,
yes,
and a transportation rate of $1.50 per barrel.
yes.
And then it says obligation, take or pay capacity. And we may have talked about that, but what does that mean specifically?
That means if you don't use it, you're still paying for it.
So whether you shipped oil or didn't, you were paying the $1.50 for the full volume that you'd committed.
Correct.
All right. It's a couple lines below that. It says quality specifications. You see that?
Yes,
It says 2 streams, WTI and WTI light, as defined in the Epic tariff. You see that?
yes,
And down below that, there's a reference to additional fees. See that?
yes,
And it says no additional fees for deliveries to the following destination points. And it says Epic initial dock, interstate grain facility, Suez capable, Epic new dock adjacent to the interstate grain facility, Suez capable. You see that?
yes,
And then below that, firm loading window, number 1, ARM shall receive 1 firm Suez loading window per month as follows. You see that?
yes.
So what did you understand Mr. Lastman was setting forth in this term sheet as to the capability of the docks that you would have access to?
That we would be able to load a Suez class vessel, which can load 1 million barrels.
All right, I want to go up.
We object again on the basis of just, this is parallel evidence, the whole thing.
Yeah, you're really getting into the parole evidence at this point. I don't know how this is exactly showing the circumstances surrounding the contract. If the term sheet is different than what's in the contract, I'm not sure why this is relevant, but so let's move along.
There's a line there that refers to line fill. Do you see that?
Yes,
There shall be no line fill required for the term of this agreement. Do you see that?
yes.
And what's the significance of line fill?
To move crude oil or gas from one location to another, there's what they refer to as line fill or line pack. That's kind of the base amount of volume that needs to be in the pipe to move from one location to another that supports the operations of that pipe.
All right, after you received this term sheet, did you and Medallion go about negotiating the terms of the contract? The specific terms of the contract?
Yes,
All right. I would like to jump to the contract itself now. Your Honor, I don't know what time you wanted to break for lunch, but this is
Are you almost the witness?
no.
Okay. Let's go ahead and take a 45-minute break. We'll reconvene at 1 o'clock.
Thank you, Your Honor.